The tide was falling back across the shallow reef when a lone fisherman noticed something unusual. Just beyond the curling line of foam where the sand met scattered rock, the water seemed to stir in a way that did not belong to the waves. A faint, rhythmic movement broke the surface, slow, uneven, like the last weak beat of a drum. He stepped closer, squinting against the glare of the late morning sun, and there it was. A sea turtle, enormous and worn, lay half submerged in the shallows, its flippers tangled in a heavy snare of old netting. Each labored motion was no more than a tired flap, as if the creature were fighting not the sea itself, but the weight of its own exhaustion. The fisherman waded forward, the water tugging gently at his knees. The turtle's shell was scarred, its surface carrying the faint, chalky traces of years spent in the deep ocean. Around its body, the ropes of the abandoned net pulled tight, biting into its flesh, holding fast no matter how the creature strained. Its head lifted once, eyes dark and still, before dropping again into the shallow foam. The sight held a quiet heaviness. Here was a being built for open water, slowed to a near stillness, its strength worn thin against a trap that did not belong to the sea. For a moment, the man simply stood, watching. The sounds around him, the call of gulls, the soft crash of waves, seemed distant, muffled by the gravity of what lay before him. The turtle shifted slightly, its front flipper pressing into the sand with a dull scrape, but the net resisted, pulling it back into helplessness. He lowered his voice as though speaking to a weary friend. "Easy, easy now," he murmured, though he knew the creature would not understand. Still, the tone carried something steady, something calming in the restless air. He bent low to touch the net. The fibers were coarse, hardened by salt and time. Each strand wrapped tightly around the turtle's body, pressing into the leathery skin, leaving faint marks that told of long hours, maybe days, spent in this trap. He could feel the faint tremor of the animal beneath his hand, the slow exhale through its beak-like mouth, a sound that was neither loud nor weak, but somewhere between, a breath held between surrender and survival. The tide lapped higher as he studied the tangle. It was not a simple knot, but layers upon layers of rope and line, twisting against one another, gripping the turtle from chest to flipper. The fisherman's hands flexed uselessly for a moment. He had no knife on him, no tool sharp enough to cut through the web. But he could not walk away. The thought alone pressed against his chest as heavy as the ocean itself. The turtle flinched suddenly, flippers thrashing with a burst of energy, water splashing against the fisherman's shirt. The surge lasted only seconds before the animal slumped again, spent from its effort. The fisherman steadied it with his palm, speaking low again. "It's all right. Stay still now." His voice was more a rhythm than a message, a sound of human presence against the wide silence of the shore. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of seaweed and salt. Around them, the world continued as if untouched by the struggle, the white curve of the horizon, the endless roll of water. Yet in the shallows, the battle between freedom and entrapment played out quietly, without witness, except for this one man who had stopped to look closer. He pressed down once more on the ropes, tracing the path of their knots, noting where they crossed and where they might give. It was work that needed more than two hands, more than his own strength alone. The turtle lifted its head again, eyes catching the light just long enough to reveal a depth that seemed both ancient and immediate. The fisherman breathed in slowly, then turned toward the shore. Help would be needed soon. Behind him, the turtle gave one last faint flap, the sound of water against rope, a whisper of movement against the tide. It was not a cry, not a call, but a reminder. Time was running thin. The fisherman's steps pressed quickly into the wet sand as he moved back toward the shore. His voice lifted, not loud, but urgent enough to carry over the wind. Two men mending nets beneath a lean wooden shelter raised their heads. Then another turned from a small boat pulled onto the beach. The fisherman's hand cut through the air in a beckoning motion, his call brief, carried by the rhythm of the sea. Within moments, they were running toward him, their bare feet splashing through shallow pools left by the tide. When they reached the water's edge, their eyes followed his gesture to the spot where the turtle lay. The men paused, their faces marked by the quiet gravity of what they saw. The animal's shell gleamed dully under the sunlight, streaked with salt and sand, its flippers twitching in weak, uneven strokes against the ropes that bound them. It lifted its head once in strained effort, then let it sink again with the heavy sound of breath through salt water. Together, they waded into the tide, their movements slow, deliberate, as though entering a fragile space. The water rose to their thighs, pushing softly against their legs, while seagrass swirled around their ankles. The turtle shifted uneasily at their approach, its eyes turning toward the movement of their bodies. The men paused again, standing still until the animal settled. Then, with a kind of reverence, they knelt into the water and studied the netting. The ropes were tightly wound, their coarse fibers layered deep into the creases of the turtle's body. Strands looped around its chest and under the curve of its flippers, pinning them against the shell in a cruel embrace. The fisherman touched the lines with careful hands, feeling where they bit deepest, following them to the knots that held strongest. Salt crystals had stiffened the fibers, and patches of green algae clung to the threads. Proof of long hours drifting before this trap found its victim. One of the men whispered under his breath, almost as if speaking to the sea itself. "Steady, old one." His voice carried low, a murmur more than a statement. The turtle responded with a faint lift of its head, water slipping from its beak-like mouth. Its body trembled with the strain of its shallow breaths. The men exchanged quiet glances, their eyes full of calculation. They knew the tide was turning, its pull growing stronger with each minute. The turtle's size made the task heavy, and the web of rope seemed endless, stretching in coils that tightened no matter how they tried to loosen them. Still they did not rush. Each hand moved with care, pressing against the net to test its give, sliding fingers into the smallest gaps where hope might be found. The animal thrashed suddenly, flippers beating weakly against the water in a desperate surge. The men steadied it with firm but gentle pressure, leaning their bodies against the tide. Foam splashed around them, the net digging deeper as the turtle's strength drained into the sea. After a few seconds, it fell still again, its sides heaving in slow exhaustion. The fishermen breathed heavily, their clothes clinging wet to their skin. Yet there was no hesitation in their posture. They adjusted their footing, tightening their circle around the creature, as though building a barrier against the weight of the ocean itself. One reached for a stone lodged in the sand, testing its edge against the rope, only to find it too blunt to cut. Another man shook his head, muttering softly, "Not enough. We'll need more." They looked once more at the animal lying before them. Its eyes reflected the pale sky, ancient and unblinking, yet dimmed by the struggle. A quiet passed through the group, the kind of silence that carried both urgency and respect. The fisherman who had first found it nodded toward the shore. He would fetch what they needed, but the others would stay, their hands resting gently on the turtle's shell to keep it from flailing against the tide. The waves rolled higher, washing over the animal's body, tugging at the men's balance. Time pressed forward, steady and unrelenting, but their calm never broke. They would not abandon the turtle to the sea's indifference. The men held their places in the water as the tide pushed higher, each wave pressing harder against their legs. The fisherman who had gone ashore returned with a small blade, its edge dulled by years of use, but sharp enough to bite through the tangled ropes. He lowered himself beside the others, and together they began the slow, deliberate work of cutting. The net was heavy, its fibers swollen with salt, clinging to the turtle's body like a second skin. Every strand seemed to tighten as it was pulled, as if the ocean itself resisted the release. The turtle stirred, flippers twitching weakly, and the men steadied it with gentle pressure. They worked in silence, broken only by the rasp of rope against the blade and the steady roll of water. Each cut freed a small section, but beneath it more strands revealed themselves, wound deep around the animal's chest and beneath its shell. The fisherman's hands shook from the strain, not from fear, but from the resistance of the rope. He pressed harder, the blade slipping through fiber after fiber, each snap sounding sharper than the waves that beat against them. The turtle thrashed suddenly, water surging as its flippers beat against the men. Foam rose around their arms, the net pulling tighter where it clung to the animal's flesh. The fishermen leaned in, holding the creature steady with their bodies. "Easy now," one whispered, his words nearly lost to the sea. The turtle's strength faded quickly, the surge of movement ending in heavy stillness, its breaths shallow, uneven. It seemed to sink further into the tide, the weight of exhaustion heavier than the ropes themselves. The sea pressed forward, waves curling higher with the turning tide. Water slapped against the fishermen's chests, pulling at their balance as they knelt. The net resisted every effort, its layers bound in knots that had hardened like stone. They tugged together, straining against the weight, their movements calm but relentless. For every rope cut, another tightened, digging deeper, pressing against the turtle's skin in grooves that would leave marks long after freedom. The fishermen's clothes clung wet to their bodies, their breaths growing heavier with the labor. Yet their hands never left the turtle, working in rhythm, each man moving as though guided by the same unspoken will. The animal's eye turned once toward them, a dark, glassy circle catching the pale light. It did not blink, only held the moment before lowering again into the water. The rope finally gave way around the front flipper, a thick coil falling loose into the tide. The freed limb moved slightly, not in strength but in faint recognition of release. Encouraged, the men pressed on, their hands moving faster though still careful, testing each knot, pulling, cutting, prying until the fibers began to unravel. The sea grew louder around them, its force unyielding, as if urging them to hurry. The turtle shifted again, this time with less struggle, its movements dulled but steady. One man placed his palm gently against the shell, grounding the creature against the sway of the current. The blade moved in steady strokes, snapping more lines, loosening more of the grip. The work was relentless, each strand another barrier. But the circle of rope around the turtle's chest began to weaken. The tide crept higher, swirling against their shoulders, the weight of the ocean pressing harder with each passing minute. Their bodies ached with the effort, arms trembling with fatigue, but their rhythm never faltered. Rope by rope, they carved away the prison that held the animal. The turtle's breaths grew slower, steadier. Its stillness no longer thrashing but waiting, suspended between exhaustion and survival. At last, a larger section of net broke free, drifting into the water like a dark shadow pulled away by the tide. One of the men caught it before it could tangle again, throwing it toward the shore. The turtle lay half-released now, its body lighter, its chest no longer bound so tightly. It gave a long, slow exhale, bubbles rising from its mouth into the foaming water. The fishermen paused for a breath, the net still clinging but weakened, their faces lined with strain. The sea roared against them, the tide climbing with relentless force. Their work was not yet done, but the battle had begun to turn. The water settled around them, quiet, except for the slow lap of the tide. For a long moment, no one moved. The turtle remained in place, its shell rising just above the surface, dark and heavy, as if carrying the memory of the struggle it had endured. The men stood in silence, their breath slowing, their clothes clinging cold and heavy to their skin. Their hands, marked with faint burns and ridges from the ropes, hovered loosely in the water, unwilling to break the stillness. The rescue was complete, but the outcome still hung between stillness and motion, waiting for the turtle to decide. Then, as if gathering strength from the depths, the turtle drew in a breath so deep it seemed to tremble through its body. A ripple moved across its shell, and one great flipper stirred. The water shifted with a low whisper, spreading in widening circles as the creature lifted its head slightly toward the fading light above the waves. Another pause, then a second stroke, slow, steady, deliberate. The men stepped back, giving it space, their silence unbroken except for the sound of water sliding past their knees. The turtle pushed forward, each movement carrying more certainty than the last. Its flippers cut through the tide with an ancient grace, muscles moving with the weight of centuries behind them. Though exhaustion still lingered in its motions, there was no hesitation. The open sea, vast and unknowable, waited only a few strokes away. The fishermen watched, their bodies still, their expressions unreadable but softened by what they had witnessed. One of them murmured, almost under his breath, "You're free now." The words barely reached the surface before being taken by the wind. The tide shifted gently, pressing against the men as they stood rooted in the shallows. Around them, the water carried fragments of rope and broken strands of seaweed, the last remains of the trap that had nearly claimed the creature's life. Beyond, the horizon stretched unbroken, the sea glowing with muted silver where the setting sun caught the ripples. The turtle moved steadily into that light, each stroke carrying it further from the place of struggle, further toward the rhythm it was meant to keep. As distance grew, its movements became stronger. The soft slap of its flippers against the water fell into a steady rhythm, a slow but certain return to the wild expanse. No sound broke the moment but the wash of small waves around the fisherman's legs. They remained where they stood, watching until the rounded shape of its shell began to blur with the water, dissolving into the shifting colors of the sea. Their bodies were weary, their hands roughened, their clothes soaked through, yet none spoke. The silence that held them was not empty but full, carrying the weight of effort, of fragility, of quiet victory. They had not conquered anything, nor claimed any prize. They had only given back what was already meant for the ocean. The turtle belonged to the tide, and now it had returned. One of the men lifted his gaze toward the horizon, where the last of the day bled into the water. The line between sea and sky blurred, turning the world into layers of fading color. A gull passed overhead, its cry brief and sharp, before gliding toward the distant waves. The others followed the sound with their eyes, then let their attention fall once more to the place where the turtle had vanished. The water folded into itself, erasing the last visible trace of the rescue. Only the circles left by the turtle's strokes remained for a breath longer, fading slowly until the sea was calm again. The fishermen stood still, letting the tide wash over them. When they finally turned back to shore, the evening wind moved through the grasses at the edge of the sand, carrying with it the quiet reminder of what they had seen. And out there, beneath the vast horizon, the turtle swam on,